Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the Robert E. Howard Show. It's time for the Robert E. Howard Show once again, where we are talking about my choice for the best of Robert E. Howard. A couple weeks ago, I think it was a couple weeks ago, I did a video about the two-volume edition of the Best of Robert E. Howard published by Del Rey. Great edition, but it is in two volumes. It is very, very, very big. And what I said in that video is what I think we need is a one volume, a really nice, big, fat one volume edition of the Best of Robert E. Howard. A book that we can give to somebody who is unfamiliar with Robert E. Howard, who's never read Robert E. Howard. A book that has his very best stories in it, and also gives you a sense of all the different kinds of things that Robert E. Howard wrote in his pulp writing career. I think we need one of those. And so what this video is about an imaginary book that does not exist, but should exist, and the contents of that volume, what I think should be in it. And as a model, I'm kind of using the very first hardcover edition of Robert E. Howard, which is a book called Skullface and Others, that was published by Arkham House and edited by August Derleth. And August Derleth chose the contents of that volume. I do not own that book, unfortunately, but I do have the reprint, the Skullface Omnibus, which is just a reprint of Skullface and Others, as it says right here on the contents page. This is a really interesting selection of Robert E. Howard stories. These are the stories that August Derleth thought were the best. And this is a magnificent book, and really somebody should just reprint this again. This was reprinted in the mid-1970s, and I don't think it's been reprinted since in a one-volume edition. And it really, somebody reprint this because it's fantastic. It has some peculiarities, I think, but it's a great book. But I have my own version of what I think this should be, a one-volume Robert E. Howard. And so let's talk about it. Let's talk about the contents of this book. What would I put in a one-volume edition of Robert E. Howard? And it would be big, because it has to be big. One of the reasons that the Del Rey edition of the Best of Robert E. Howard was two volumes is just because it's so hard to, not include all of the great stuff. So of course, after you watch this, you will think of stories that should be in here that I didn't include. And that's fair, but this is what I think should be in here. So if I were editing a one-volume Best of Robert E. Howard, I would start off with the first story being The Shadow Kingdom. The Shadow Kingdom, the story that many people believe is the first sword and sorcery story. King Kull made his debut in The Shadow Kingdom, and it's just magnificent. A great story. Beautifully written sword and sorcery fantasy story. Has everything you'd want in a sword and sorcery story, I think. And it's so good that I think it will make you a Robert E. Howard fan. And if it doesn't, you probably won't like Robert E. Howard. It's a magnificent story, and I think it should be in a best of volume. It should be the first story, as it was in the Del Rey edition. So yeah, it should start off with The Shadow Kingdom as the first. And the second story should be Worms of the Earth. Worms of the Earth. A Bran Morn story. And it's not just a fantasy story, it's very much a horror story. Del Rey did put this in their best of horror stories of Robert E. Howard. And it should be there. It's a magnificent story. It could be Robert E. Howard's greatest story. It's that good. Worms of the Earth. So Bran Morn's story, The Pictish King, that should be number 2 in the volume. And then number 3, Kings of the Night. Kings of the Night, which is a fantasy historical story where King Kull is brought forward in time to battle the Romans alongside Bran Morn. So it's a team up story with Bran Morn and King Kull. And it's a great story. It's great. Great, great scenes of ancient warfare in this story. It's a wonderful story, and definitely deserves to be in a best of volume. And I would put it right here at number 3 after that, after those King Kull and Bran Morn stories. We'll get them together in Kings of the Night. It's great. Number 4, we're going to have a couple stories from one of my favorite characters, Solomon Kane. Red Shadows is number 4. You got to have Red Shadows in a best of volume because it's a great Solomon Kane story. It's not the best Solomon Kane story, but it's really, really good. So yeah, Red Shadows would be number 4. And I'd follow that up with what I think is the best Solomon Kane story, which is Wings in the Night. Wings in the Night is just fantastic. What a great story. Definitely one of Robert E. Howard's best. Again, a fantasy story, a horror story. Great Solomon Kane story. And so Wings in the Night would be number 5. And then I would get to Conan. And I had to think, how many Conan stories do I want to put in my best of volume? I think August Derleth and his put in 4 Conan stories, I think. And his choice of Conan stories, actually he put in 5. He put in 5. And his choices were different than my choices. I put in 3. Just because there's so many other stories that are not Conan that I wanted to put in this volume. And so I had to decide, okay, what are the best Conan stories? Not just my favorite, but what are the best? And so this is what I think we've got. So for the 6th story in this volume, The Tower of the Elephant, which is, I don't think you can dispute The Tower of the Elephant being one of the best Conan stories. It is one of the best sword and sorcery stories ever written. It's great, The Tower of the Elephant. So yeah, we have to put that in there. Such a wonderful story about young Conan seeking the heart of the elephant in the Elephant Tower. Great. It's a great story. And then number 7, Queen of the Black Coast. Again, another fantastic story. I nearly put in the Scarlet Citadel in this place, just because I think that is so good and it's one of my favorite stories. But I think Queen of the Black Coast is better, so I put that here. At number 7, Queen of the Black Coast, so good. About Belit, the pirate queen that Robert E. Howard's most famous creation, Conan, falls in love with. Great story. So yeah, that's number 7. And number 8 has to be Beyond the Black River. Possibly the best Conan story of all, Beyond the Black River. Just such a great story. I love it. And it had to go in here in a best of volume. So Beyond the Black River. Great story. Kind of a Conan frontier story. It's wonderful. If you've never read it, you have to read it. But definitely, I think, one of the best, if not the best, Conan story. So then we're moving away from Conan. And so the 9th story in here is a horror story, The Black Stone, which could be Robert E. Howard's best horror story. It's one of his most famous. It's a great and terrifying and disturbing horror story. Very much influenced by Robert E. Howard's good friend, H.P. Lovecraft. Although Robert E. Howard, everything he wrote was a Robert E. Howard story, no matter what influenced it. He put his personality in everything. And The Black Stone is just such a great horror story. And I follow that with another horror story, Pigeons from Hell, which has a ridiculous title, but is a great story. Fantastic horror story, Pigeons from Hell. And so we've got a couple horror stories there. I would have liked to put more in here, but there's too many other stories. That's the problem with making a best of volume. So we have those, and then I follow that up with one of Robert E. Howard's humorous westerns, one of his best, A Man Eating Jeopard. A Man Eating Jeopard. Robert E. Howard's westerns, his humorous westerns, were tremendously popular at the time that he wrote them. And he could have gone on, if he had lived longer, to focus more on that kind of thing. And they're very different from his fantasy stories and his horror stories, but he puts so much of his own personality into them. And he puts so much of his sense of humor into those stories, which you don't find in a lot of his other stories. So not in the same way. So definitely had to put something like that in here. And Jeopard is one of my favorites. I'm going to follow that up with a boxing story, The Bulldog Breed, which is my personal favorite out of the boxing stories. So I had to put The Bulldog Breed in here. Featuring Mike the Bulldog. Well named Bulldog, I think. And, a great Robert E. Howard character right there. So, yeah, a boxing story. He wrote a ton of boxing stories. They're not read too often anymore, although we are going to be getting new editions of his boxing stories soon from the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press. Look forward to those. Certainly, if you're interested in Robert E. Howard, you have to check those out. And they're tremendously entertaining. So there you go. I follow that up with Hawk of the Hills, which is a story of Francis Xavier Gordon Elborak. There were a few Elborak stories I could have put in here, but I put in that one because I do like that one an awful lot. I'm not actually positive that that's the best Elborak story, but it's one I like a lot, so I put that in here. And I follow that up with one of his historical stories. I think this is his best historical story. If I had to choose, and I did, I think this is probably the best one. And so I put in The Shadow of the Vulture, which is just an epic story. It's great. And it has the character Red Sonja in it, who became Red Sonja in the comic books. Roy Thomas adapted that character into a new character, but this is the original version of that character, is in The Shadow of the Vulture, and it's a great story. If you've never read it, you've got to read it. It's fantastic. I follow that up with a story I like a lot, which is The Dark Man. The Dark Man is a wonderful fantasy story. It's kind of a Bran Morn story, but it takes place long after Bran Morn has passed away. Excellent story. So I had to put that in here because I think that is one of his best. I follow that up with another fantasy story, The Valley of the Worm. The Valley of the Worm, which is another great story. There were a couple stories. This is James Allison story where we have and in those stories we have this character who can remember his past lives. And there are a couple really good stories in that short series, but this is the best one, I think, The Valley of the Worm. I think it probably is definitely one of Robert E. Howard's best, so that should be in here. And the next one is story number 17 is Skullface. Skullface, which is a story that's very much of its time, very much a pulp story. Based in part, influenced at least by the Fu Manchu stories of Sax Rohmer, but I think it's better than those stories. It's an excellent pulp story, and it gives you a sense of those weird menace stories that Robert E. Howard wrote. I think it's probably the best one of that group of stories. And so, yeah, you gotta have Skullface, I think. It's long, but that's okay, because this is a long book. But long as it is, it had to end somewhere, so it ends at story number 18. This is the final story I would put in the book, and this is The Gray God Passes, which is just an excellent and moody fantasy story, a great Robert E. Howard story, which was turned into a very good issue of Conan the Barbarian by Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor Smith. But it wasn't a Conan story, but it was a great fantasy story. And in my opinion, you can't have an edition of the best of Robert E. Howard without this particular story being in there. So there you go. That's my choice. This would be a nice big fat volume that I would love to see published, but it won't be published. But I would love to see a best of Robert E. Howard edition. I would love to see it, even if it didn't have this particular selection of stories. Like I said, I would like to see this reprinted again. I'd love it if somebody would do that. But this is my selection. If I were an editor and if I were putting together an edition of the best of Robert E. Howard stories, this would be it. Okay, guys, I'll shut up now. I've gone on long enough. I will catch you next time.